Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for attending our special panel on migration from Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul. My name is Professor John Park. I'm Professor of Asian American Studies here at UC Santa Barbara. And it's, in my original remarks, I said that it was a pleasure to invite you to this stage, but I don't know that that's the appropriate word. I'm very grateful, especially to our panelists, to Professor Masterson, who helped us organize this particular event. But the topic is a very sad and serious topic. And I happen to be teaching a lower division class on immigration here at UCSB, and we were covering the fall of Saigon. And we were covering Vietnam and the Vietnam War and the American pullout. And we were doing that in September as these events in Afghanistan were unfolding. And as we were watching the news and as we were seeing so many people in danger, and I'm a legal historian. I know that it's not the same. I know that the fall of Saigon is very different than the fall of Kabul, and we must be very careful along these parallels. And it's not always that history repeats, but boy, did it rhyme. And I just think that it was a moment for all of us to reflect very deeply about the consequences of American foreign policy, right, and the desperate circumstances that people face as they were trying to leave their home country. With that, I'm again extremely grateful to our panelists and to Professor Masterson, who will continue our program. Professor Masterson is Professor of Political Science here at UC Santa Barbara. He will introduce all of the panelists who will then speak in turn. And once again, I would like to thank the Dean of Social Sciences, my faculty colleagues in the Migration Initiative, right? Amanda for helping us organize, right? And Professor Masterson, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. So thank you to everyone who's attending today, to everyone in the audience, and also thank you so much to our three panelists. I'm really excited and proud to announce Laila Ayub first, who's an organizer and immigration attorney whose work includes coordinating advocacy efforts, assisting in litigation, and leading release campaigns for asylum seekers detained in immigration prisons. And she's a co-coordinator of Project ANAR, and she assists Afghans with humanitarian parole applications to gain entry into the United States. We also have Ugai Momand, who's an attorney at Morgan Lewis and a UC Berkeley Law alumna. She started Project ANAR with co-founder Laila to address the legal needs of Afghans and to file humanitarian parole applications. And she's filed numerous petitions to facilitate the reunion of Afghan families in the US. And third, we have Roxana Mousavian, who is also an attorney. She's affiliated with Project ANAR, and she's a co-director at Pangea Legal Services, which is a nonprofit advocacy organization in San Francisco. And Ms. Mousavian is a graduate of Yale Law School. And I am just so excited and proud to have the three of you here, and just really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us today.
Okay, so I can start, I believe. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you to everyone who is attending this. I'm going to start off by just giving a little bit of background, including some history, not a ton of history, because there's a lot of history that we really cannot cover all tonight. Yeah, so we often think of like this current moment in Afghanistan with the lens of the last 2 decades of US involvement following the US invasion in 2001. But foreign intervention is something that has been happening in Afghanistan long before that, not just by the US. So in 1921, that's when Afghanistan gained independence from Britain, and Afghanistan had a monarchy for many decades following that. People often see the images of the 1970s in Afghanistan and women attending school. Those are not telling the whole story of what was going on in the country at that time, of course. There were class divides, there were many people still impacted by the previous decades of occupation. In the 1970s, there was a lot of political change in Afghanistan. That's also the time of the Cold War and lots happening around the world. And in 1973, the king was overthrown by someone who named himself the president after that. In the late 1970s, that president was overthrown and the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was established. And in 1979, that's when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the US was involved in throwing support behind the Mujahideen, which are a segmented group, not even something that can be referred to as one collective group, because there were so many different people that were just fighting back at that time. And the US was supporting them, and that is historically connected to the rise of the Taliban as well. In response to what was happening in the late 70s, many Afghans became refugees. That's when many of Afghan Americans, our families, were refugees, fled to neighboring countries, and either accessed the international refugee system, which I can talk about in a moment, or found a pathway to another country where they could seek asylum, or just ended up living in neighboring countries like Pakistan and Iran for many, many years. That history is relevant because that type of political instability and occupation and imperialism, that is one of the reasons that many people become refugees. It's at the time, some of the international systems were different. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the immigration context here. I know some people might have some of this context, but someone can be a refugee in a sense that we recognize them as a refugee because they're fleeing war, they're fleeing even like an environmental disaster, but that doesn't make them legally a refugee. Someone has to be named a refugee after they get to a third country, and either by the UN or an international organization, they become designated as a refugee after an interview process. And then if someone, for example, wanted to come to the US as a refugee, they would have to try to apply for the US refugee admissions program. That is something that takes years and it's very uncertain. So in an emergency situation, it's not really easy to access a refugee admissions process. If someone wants to seek asylum, they have to get to the country where they try to seek asylum and ask for asylum there. So again, it's really hard to do that in the US if you can't get to the US. So many people spent years in another country. If they eventually made it to the US, they might have accessed the US through a visa process or something else. And this connection also to US intervention at that time in the 70s and now in this year as well, also is really important to understanding the options for immigration that have been available to Afghans. In recent years, it has been very difficult for Afghans to migrate. They either have to try to access one of those refugee processes, which takes years and you have to go to a third country, or you have to have family in the US if you want to come to the US that qualify for a family-based pathway that can apply for their relatives to get here, which is something that takes many years and is very difficult as well. otherwise like student or work visas, or one of the only options that so many people had and that you might have heard of is for people who have worked with the US government in some capacity. Other countries like the UK and Canada have similar systems, and there's so many people who do qualify for that and who have been left behind despite qualifying for that, but it's still something that is so limited and only available to those who can prove that they are allies of the US by either like through their work history. And it's a very difficult process as well. I'll pass it over now to Ugay to talk a little bit more about what that has been like recently and what was happening in August.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Ugay. Thank you again to Professor Park and Professor Masterson for having us, and for Amanda for putting this all together. So I will start us off just a little bit talking about what was happening in August in particular and our specific response to it. So Laila went over some of the immigration pathways, and a lot of the immigration pathways to the US that exist right now are not for the everyday person. They are specifically for folks who have worked with the US Army or are US affiliated in some way. And for a lot of us, truly this project came about because we were looking for options for our family members and for our friends. Laila and I and Roxana, we're all attorneys, and being an attorney in a family with not a lot of attorneys, you get asked every question under the sun. So truly, when the Taliban started to take over in Afghanistan in August, Laila and I coordinated on just compiling resources, and truly just immigration resources about what types of options there were. And we tried to put together a document that just listed out options, right? It said, you can get a special immigrant visa if you're US affiliated. You can get P2 processing, which is a new type of refugee class that the US government announced but hasn't done anything for yet. And then also humanitarian parole. And humanitarian parole is a temporary permission to come to the United States. It doesn't grant anyone a visa. It doesn't grant anyone permanent status in the US. It's purely just a piece of paper that says, hey, you can be here for now. And like I said, it's one of the only options for a lot of people. And we started to get a crazy number of responses. We put out a Google Doc and like a social media post on our personal social medias, and it really quickly went viral and was reposted so many times. It got out of control. And before we knew it, we had hundreds of responses from Afghans saying, hey, I need help. It looks like I qualify for this humanitarian parole thing. Can you help me? And also hundreds of people that we know, attorneys that we know, who wanted to help. And that's when we were connected to Roxana. This project happened so quickly, and I think it speaks to the nature of this emergency, right? People, there's such a level of desperation and help needed that everything just came together so quickly. And in August, like I think a lot of people in the US were really surprised by the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, but I have to qualify that by saying that everyone who is from Afghanistan, who has connections to Afghanistan, who has connections to the region, knew this was coming. There have been ongoing quote unquote peace talks that have legitimized the Taliban for years and years, for a very long time. And we all knew that as soon as the announcement was made that the US was going to withdraw, it was going to be crazy. And it was. And we also knew that type of specific Biden's announcement that there was going to be this type of withdrawal was going to create even more security issues and even more urgency to what was going on. So when Laila and I put this document together, it was actually before the Taliban takeover of Kabul. because we knew it was coming, and we knew that we had been hearing from our friends and our families that the provinces were being taken over and the Taliban were moving into Kabul, and which really, I just have to say, it was such a surreal, crazy month. It's like it's incomprehensible how quickly all of this went down and how we all came together. But after we put out that document, Roxana saw it through a mutual friend that I went to law school with, and quite literally sent me an Instagram DM and was like, let's do something about this. So Roxana, one of our other co-organizers, who is an attorney at Centro Legal de la Raza, which is a Bay Area legal aid group that does immigration along with other things, we all just started talking and immediately got to work on trying to find out what the options were for Afghans. And we already had a list of volunteers. We already had a list of people who needed help. So we were like, okay, let's do a training. Let's match these people up. Let's file their applications and we'll go from there. And the Taliban takeover, I believe, was August 15th or 16th. And we had this training on August 23rd. And since that date, we have been assigning volunteer attorneys to Afghans in need of help on their humanitarian parole applications. And the project very, very quickly grew. We're helping, we've had 9,000 people reach out to us, and we're still working on getting those cases assigned out. We're working with, I think, 1,100 attorneys or so. We've raised a lot of money and have already burned through it all. Because the applications cost $575 per application. And when I say per application, I quite literally mean per every single person in the family. So it's not one application fee for a family, and we don't come in small families at all. It's like minimum 7 people. So it's really, it's a really expensive thing. I don't know very many people who have thousands of dollars just laying around that they can put towards these applications. So we, along with that, we've been fundraising, we've been trying to adjust the way we approach this issue. But the thing with humanitarian parole is that it's so rare, it's not used in this way. In a typical year, USCIS, which is the Citizenship and Immigration Services Office, which handles all of these applications, I believe they receive about 2,000 of these applications per year. And so far, they've already received 20,000. And parole is something that's has been used historically. And after the fall of Saigon, Professor Park mentioned that earlier, there was 130,000 people that were paroled into the country. And there are folks from Afghanistan here in the US right now who have been paroled into the country. And those are, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the evacuation flights, and there's a lot of news about, 70,000 people have been evacuated from Afghanistan. So those are the flights that took place between August 15th and August 31st. There has been nothing since then. And all of those folks are now either at US bases or are on something that the US government calls the lily pads, which is US bases and other third countries that are going to be moved to the US eventually. So those are also parolees, but it's a different process than what we're doing. Those are folks who are granted parole on arrival, and we are still advocating for people who are stuck in Afghanistan. I do want to mention, though, that parole has a lot of risk in terms of the type of permission it is, right? It's a temporary permission. And so that means that when you are in the United States, you have to adjust your status in some way. So you have to apply for asylum, you have to apply for some type of visa through a family member, or you have to, if you qualify for a special immigrant visa, you have to do that process. And typically parole is a year or 2, and you have to start those procedures before that time expires, or you risk becoming undocumented, which brings along a whole other set of legal and personal issues. So it is a difficult process, but it is quite literally the only thing that so many people qualify for. And we've expressed to people that this is a hard process and it may or may not work. But people in Afghanistan are in such danger, are in really dire conditions right now that they're going for it anyway. And so we try to provide the resources to allow people to do that. But it is an uncertain field. We don't know. We've been doing this for 2 months, but we don't know what the next 2 months will hold even. So I will pass it off to Roxana now to discuss kind of our related advocacy.
Thank you. My name is Roxana Musavian. I am an immigration attorney at Pangea Legal Services, and I'm honored to get to be one of the co-coordinators of Project ANAR. Thank you so much to Professor Park and Daniel and Amanda for making space for this conversation, and to all of you for showing up on a Thursday late afternoon. I bet a lot of you don't have Friday classes, and so I'm just especially grateful for you making time for this at the end of the week. I wanted to just pick up on some of the threads that Laila and Ugai have been talking about, and I guess the focus on so our project exclusively works on humanitarian parole. There's a lot of work right now, thankfully, being done by lots of different groups related to the needs of Afghans, both who are trying to get to the US and who are already in the US. What we're doing is a very, very narrow piece of that whole puzzle. And even kind of within the legal part of that puzzle, Laila talked about, and you guys as well, how there's lots of different parts of that legal, there's different legal avenues. We're focusing on only one of them. Ugai talked quite a bit about why we picked this one. And then I want to emphasize that we've stuck with our decision. This was the very first decision we made as a group, back on August 18th. And we've changed course in a lot of ways, but we're following through on the legal intervention that we're trying to contribute as a part of a lot of things that a lot of different people are doing. Ugai foreshadowed some of the challenges and the limitations of our strategy and of this kind of collective approach. And I wanted to go a little deeper into them. The main one is that since August 31st, USCIS has not adjudicated any humanitarian parole application.
I mean, thank you so much. I mean, one thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on is, I mean, even though, this is the events in Afghanistan over the last two and a half months, and migration from Afghanistan have been framed in maybe the language of crisis or language of something that just arose because of the U.S. withdrawal. Now, I don't see this as a new crisis. We can look back just throughout the 20-teens, and throughout that period, there was another wave of media coverage of huge number of refugees and asylum seekers arriving in Europe, including many Afghans, people taking extremely dangerous trips by land and sea. And I see the events over the last 2.5 months linked to what we saw before this, and things before that as part of a current migration system that establishes a stark separation between so-called economic migration and so-called political asylum. And so I would love to hear your thoughts from the work that you've been doing and your experiences around, to what extent is this crisis a product of chaotic and poorly planned US withdrawal, or to what extent do you see this as a result of a pre-existing unjust migration system or systems?
I'm happy to start that. Yeah, I think it's definitely the second. I think like exactly what you were saying, Professor Masterson, this like for years, well, let me take a step back, that we or our governments determine who is a worthy migrant or refugee. Even just using the term refugee instead of migrant, it denotes some sort of value, or like that this person is entitled to come here. And yeah, so personally, I don't talk about migrants in that way, but that is what Afghans have been dealing with for decades. Throughout the last 10 years and before that, we heard stories of Afghans like getting deported from Europe and spending years in refugee camps in Greece, for example, because they're seen as economic migrants, often with some sort of characterization as like they're young men, so they can't be vulnerable to systemic issues in Afghanistan. And obviously that's not something that is only experienced by Afghan migrants, but it's very clearly seen with Afghans in recent years. And the one group that has been consistently seen as deserving are Afghans who can be framed in terms of their value to the US military. And even then, they have been left behind. We see a lot of that language of like Afghans being left behind, our allies being left behind. And there is, even with the support of veterans groups who hold a lot of weight, so many Afghans have been left behind in that process. Yeah, so there was one other thing I wanted to say related to that, but just that this is something that they're going to experience. You know, folks who come here on parole who might have to apply for asylum if that's their only option for relief, they're going to experience that again. They're going to have to prove that they are worthy, that they have a valid asylum claim. I can speak to my own family's experience that things change by the time someone reaches the asylum process, and they have to prove that the conditions that they fled are still the same now. So if the government changes and, you know, people who are still in Afghanistan are facing better circumstances than those who are already here, have established lives here, have to prove that, like, why they deserve to stay here. So yeah, it's something that has been ongoing historically, that has led to so many people having such limited options, and it's going to affect them throughout the rest of their process.
So, I mean, I want to, in a couple minutes, open up for members of the audience to ask questions. But before we move on to that, there's, I mean, sort of two other things that I wanted to ask about. And I mean, the first is, I mean, the system of humanitarian parole is, I wasn't aware of it before, you know, the last couple of months. And when, you know,
none of us were really that aware of it.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the long-term prospects for people who are arriving through humanitarian parole. And so, I mean, from what I understood, you know, from Ugai's description of it, you know, this is a situation where people are allowed to stay in the US temporarily and then need to apply through some other process for longer term stay through SIV status or a visa or asylum. And I mean, is there any indication from your work so far? I know that it's still early on in this process and we have yet to see, but do you think that a lot of people who have come through humanitarian parole are actually going to be able to find ways to stay long-term in the country? So long-term, what's the plan? What are the prospects?
I can start. I think that the long-term legal prospects, yes, I absolutely think a lot of people are going to be able to find legal avenues to stay in this country. And I think the people in the worst legal position are going to have to rely on asylum, for which asylum law is, my family's from Iran. I think that Iran is probably one of the easiest countries to get asylum, if you're from, to get asylum in the US, because you know, you open up the State Department's country conditions report about Iran, and it terrifies me to like think about the country. The biases in government, in the media and reporting, and the portrayal of it's going to make it quite straightforward for people to establish persecution, or the threat or risk of persecution. But I think the more complicated question is whether people are like what life they're going to have here, and what that life is in meaningful ways, what it's going to include and what it's not going to include. And I currently, people are coming in, when the people who are arriving they're living on US military bases where they're effectively prisoners. And we've heard of reports of, this is the example that I always come to, and Laila and I've heard me say it like a billion times, but I just like, my hair's still on fire from still learning this, of people giving birth to children on US military bases without doctors present. This is like 2021 right now during our lifetimes. The setting aside, imagining a year into the future when hopefully military bases are like totally outside the process of getting access to benefits, to housing, food. I mean, it's going to continue to be a crisis, really. And yeah, I think that's really, that's what keeps me up at night more than anything else.
I'll just add that there's also like easy policy choices that can be made to change this for folks too. For example, there's like a coalition of organizations that have put out a letter demanding temporary protected status for Afghans, and that's something that is commonly used to grant a certain population temporary permission to stay in the US and not face deportation. Now, Afghans right now are not facing deportation anytime soon, and that is still not enough, but it's something that the government can easily do to grant like a certain period of reassurance that people can stay here.
Again, for the students on the call, temporary protected status is where someone is here often on a temporary visa, like they're a student or they're visitor, and they are asking our federal government for permission to stay longer and not be returned to a country where they may be in danger. Right. So it's temporary protected status usually for people who are already in the United States, physically here, whereas humanitarian parole is for people who are coming to our borders.
So before we open up for Q&A, so I know a lot of students in my classes want to go to law school. A number of students who talked to me before this event are really excited about the work that you're doing. And so I think it would be really valuable if you could talk about some of the ways that students could get involved in the work that you're doing now. I know we talked a little bit about this before this event started today. So I'd love it if you could share with the students what they can do to get involved, how they can help.
Yeah, I can start us off. So we are, all of these applications that we're helping file, our volunteer attorneys do it, but then they send them to us to file. And so we need a lot of help reviewing these applications. And that's something, it's basically paralegal work. It's something that folks can be trained to do. We actually have an upcoming training this Saturday if folks are interested, and I can pass the information to Professor Park and Professor Masterson, but we need help doing that. We need help paying for the filing fees. So if you want to fundraise, I know raising money is really, really difficult. But we are in desperate need of more funds to pay for these applications. And then also today we put out a call script to call your representatives and demand action around these humanitarian parole applications. So if folks have the ability to mobilize the groups that you're in, the classes that you're in, to just call the representatives and drop a quick voicemail, that would be wonderful. and it'll bring more attention to these issues, hopefully more pressure to actually get these applications approved. So.
Yeah, that would be, I mean, that would be great if, I would be really happy to distribute to anyone who's interested, information about the training on Saturday, and I think Professor Park and I can follow up about ways that we can organize here on campus around a fundraiser or a training event. And just a quick, sort of comment to back up your call on people to call their representatives and use this script is, years ago I worked on Capitol Hill for a congresswoman from Maine, and at least in the case of that congressperson, she really did care when people called. She wanted to know who had called and what they had said. And that was a big part of my job, compiling the things that constituents had said. And so, on the outside, it might feel like these calls don't matter, but I think a lot of Congress people actually do pay attention to what their constituents say in these calls. Does anyone want to say anything else on that topic about how students can get involved before we open up for Q&A?
I guess
Okay,
just
well, sorry, go ahead, please.
If I, like, whether or not you get involved in what we're doing, I would be remiss to be talking to a group of college students and not like reflect on how privileged a position it is to be in a college environment and to have the space and time to really do whatever you want with your time. And I like the rest of your life can be the same way as long as you build the muscle to like figure out what you want to do with your time. So I really, really hope that all of you have like a lot of fun and clarity in pursuing whatever it is that, and if there's any questions you have for us or any way that we can support you as individuals related to this project or otherwise, in realizing whatever it is you're passionate about, yeah, well, the world's better for it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, I appreciate you taking a moment to think about the audience here. We can't see everybody, unfortunately, like we would be able to if we were in a room together. But I think that, I mean, a lot of what you guys have shared is really powerful as a lesson that, like you guys said, the law was made by people and people can change the law, and the world was made by people and people can change it. And so the idea that that just looking at the work that you're doing, you are helping people in families fundamentally changing their lives through this humanitarian parole system. And there's an analog to what I hope the students on the call are thinking about and how they're going to direct their energies going forward. That there's so much possibility out there when you direct your energy toward a cause to actually really change things for people and to have an impact. So I'm just so happy to be able to have you in this have this meeting today with the three of you. So
also, if I could really quickly, I do want to say, so I'm not an immigration attorney, and I just wanted to, but I am an attorney. So I think what I've learned very quickly in the past 2 months, and I hope this resonates with some of the undergrads here, is that the first thing you start out doing in your career is not the end all be all. Things change, and things change quickly. And like, I don't even know if I'll still be doing my job in 6 months because of how much of this work I've done, right? I have no idea. So I think more than anything, it's important to just take what you know and take what you think you are capable of and find people who help you along the way and just try to do good with whatever you have. So I do just want to say that, because this is not, immigration law is not my thing at all. I did a tiny bit of it in law school, but that's it. So I did just want to throw that out there.
yeah, thank you, Uga. I know, speaking with some students, they have a concern that if they go to law school, they'll have loans and they'll be constrained in the type of work that they'll be able to do given those loans. So that's encouraging to hear that from you.
I have loans. I work a big corporate job, and somehow I still ended up doing this type of work. And maybe that's unusual, but it can happen.
I half regret telling my students, several have asked me whether this would be recorded. And I think by recording this, we may have limited in-person or at least the Zoom attendance. But I think speaking to my students who are listening to the recording, Professor Masterson and I are easy to find. I used to do TPS and humanitarian parole many years ago. And I would be happy to train any student who's interested in law school and getting a sense of what the kind of work is involved. I'd be happy to train and help organizations like that. You know, part of me is both extremely angry that the Biden administration is behaving this way, and then part of me, I'm like really inspired by your work. And I think your devotion to each other and to the collective enterprise that you represent. And I'm just, I'm very honored to meet you. Yeah.
I would just add to that last point then. I think we have shared that there are a lot of opportunities to be involved, but like to really make it clear, this humanitarian parole is something that like in the immigration lawyer listservs, people keep asking the same questions over and over again because they're not all familiar with it. So it is something that you can learn. And I don't think anyone should be scared of it. Like the job I was doing before, over the summer, we did humanitarian parole applications as an advocacy strategy. And it was undergraduate students working on the applications and completing the form. So like it is very feasible for this to be something that you work on, even if you like are reviewing applications or whatever it is. It's, I don't want anyone to be scared of that just because we are lawyers.
So I know that we, I don't want to close off this conversation, but I just want the audience to know that, you know, that if you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box and we can take some questions from the audience. But I also did, Roxana or Guy or Laila, did you want to say anything else on this topic before we moved on to audience Q&A? Okay, so so we have a question from Ingmar Sturm, who asks how many politicians in the US actually campaign on providing Afghans with visa options. Is it an issue that you can win elections on in California or in the US?
No, but it should be. I mean, I think a lot of the challenge of like immigration issues is exactly this. While a growing majority of the country are immigrants or, you know, family members of immigrants, it's yeah, it's still not a campaign issue that you win or lose elections on. And that's why we see people who advance pretty racist policies winning elections.
And right, this present war has been going on for 20 years, right? People move on very, very quickly. People have moved on from the takeover of Kabul, right? The takeover of Afghanistan really, really quickly. And we've mentioned this throughout, but like, this is to me, it's one and the same issue, right? This is the same issue that brought my parents to this country. It's the same issue that's affecting family members and friends in Afghanistan right now. And people just lose interest. And there's all of the rhetoric, if there is any at all of it is focused on those who have helped the US. So it's a very US-centric, US imperialist framework of who we do and do not deem worthy of coming into this country. So I did just want to drop that really quickly.
Could I ask one question about your experiences with whether you've been working at all in connecting people? I know you said, you know, a lot of people who have arrived through humanitarian parole are still on military bases, but is there any connection between the humanitarian parole system and sort of local communities to help people get settled? How, beyond the military bases, beyond people stuck on military bases, how are people landing on their feet after arrival? With the U.S. resettlement system, there are partnerships with a number of NGOs that provide people with limited services and some money after arrival. Outside of military bases, how are people coming in through humanitarian paroles, getting a start in the U.S.?
So I'll just start by, I hope this isn't too technical, but the humanitarian parole that we're applying for people who are not in the US is through USCIS, as we've explained a little bit. And then the people who are here on parole, for the most part, that have been paroled in are people who managed to get onto one of those military flights that we saw in August, and they arrive at the border, like in an airport, and border officers parole them in. So that is how simple a parole decision can be made, is literally any agent standing there and saying, okay, I'm stamping your travel document, you have parole now. So those people who had the stamps in their passports, for the most part, have ended up on military bases. I don't know if there are people who, there's probably definitely people who didn't make it onto a base, because in August, for example, there were some people who chose to leave from an airport to go meet with their family. And luckily, there have been some policy changes over recent weeks that allow parolees to access benefits. Normally, a parolee does not have access to benefits, as a matter of policy. They can apply for work authorization, but it's the government has discretion whether or not to grant that. And now parolees are eligible generally for work authorization. They still have to apply for it. And they are eligible for refugee resettlement benefits. So SIV applicants, special immigrant visas, other categories already receive refugee resettlement benefits. And that is through the government. These 6 organizations, I think, are the recipients of the main grants, and then they might contract with other NGOs across the country to distribute resettlement services to people arriving in their communities. And some local governments have decided to put a certain amount of money towards parolee benefits through those organizations in their areas. And Congress last month authorized parolee benefits for people who arrive in the next 2 years, I think. And that'll give people access to some healthcare, some housing assistance, things like that. In addition to that, in the last couple of weeks, a new system has started to roll out called sponsorship circles, which allows just community members to come together and put money towards supporting arriving refugees. And just beyond that, we've seen so much community support in general. We raise so much money just for filing fees. People are ready to receive people in their communities. There's been a lot of donation drives and people getting supplies to people on bases, and setting people up in their homes when they get off of bases.
I wonder, panelists, if you could see the chat. There is a question in the chat from Mr. or Ms. Lin, and it's about the backgrounds of the people that are applying for humanitarian parole. And the question is, are they, the folks who are applying and the people that you're helping, are they relatively privileged people in Afghanistan? And I guess that's a fair question and an interesting question. So of the people that you've helped file applications for, what is their general profile?
So I really like this question, and I appreciate you for asking it. So out of our applicants, about 40% of them have a US-based connection. And I think this is really, really important because migration from Afghanistan has basically come in waves, right? And there has been migration before my parents' generation, but my parents' generation is the first I know. And a lot of the folks that immigrated to the US from Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s, when my family came here, were from a relatively privileged space. They had some US connection, they were educated in the US, they had money, they had something that gave them the ability to come to the US. And so those 40% of people, they could be connected to folks like me, like my family. And that's good. I'm glad we're helping folks who are still in Afghanistan. I have family members myself, like my cousins, my aunts, uncles who are still there. And that's good. But I think the 60% of people who have reached out to us who don't have US-based connections have never had that privilege and have never had that connection before. So I think it's, and it's so strange because I think it speaks to the power of social media. Like we put out all of our material out on Instagram, and our sign up form to sign up to be one of the applicants we help was only shared by word of mouth. It was never publicly shared. We just shared it to people we knew who shared it to people they knew. And that reached Afghanistan. That reached people in Afghanistan that don't have US-based connections. And those are people from both Kabul and other areas. They're from urban and rural areas. So I think that's really, really important. And I think that's one of the most impactful things to me about this work is that I think we're truly working with a group of Afghans who have not had this type of access before. And that's critical. So thank you for asking that question. It's a good question.
Can I add just a second? Mugai mentioned that we never made the form to sign up for legal assistance like public, in that we never posted it on a website or shared it on social media. And I like, on one hand, that could obviously lead to like access, like further access concerns, right? Because like you have to be somewhat connected to someone. But I just want to put that in context of like the reality where we closed this form that we have 9,000 people from in mid-September, because after less than a month of having it open, we were concerned about the reality of whether or how we were going to be able to follow through with the 9,000 people who had already reached out. So yeah, and everything that Ugai just said is like 100% true. Could we, like, if we just put it on the website, would we get more people that probably could benefit from like the privilege of this opportunity in a variety of ways? Absolutely. But we're not academics. We're having to like hold ourselves accountable for like we have to do something for each of these people, and with your help we can do more of it. But yeah, I wanted to share some of those constraints.
I also wanted to add really quickly that I think typically in immigration services, like if you're a private lawyer and you have a limited number of like pro bono cases that you can take, for example, people would also be screened for additional things that we did not do. Like that, what we've talked about with like determining whether someone is like has a meritorious asylum claim, whether they are really deserving of coming here and being a refugee. We did not do any of that. We just said, if somebody is asking for help and somebody wants to try this and they understand that this might be a long shot, but we're doing it for folks if it's their only option. If they understood that and they said, yes, I want this help, we are connecting them to services. We have not screened anyone to see if they're really vulnerable or anything like that.
And I know, like, I feel like I was really negative on the question on like hope about like change, and I guess like I like related to this, like we I feel like we're making it clear quite how scrappy we are, but I don't want to like undersell how like with it and like organized this all is. We've gotten funding, you know, in the last, since August, when we started doing this, like the state of California set up a grant fund that like they found out about what we were doing, and they like came to us and were generous enough to give us some money and some support. And I mean, I think it's pretty cool to like be living in the world and doing this work at a time when like the fact that this project is exclusively run by women and non-gender binary people that are majority Afghans, who are all pretty young, and like we're getting the support of the state in some forms. That's hope. I don't know that the same would have been possible like 10 years ago, you know.
So could I ask one question to just, again, you know, revealing my ignorance about the humanitarian parole system, but, you know, the refugee resettlement process has a complex set of sort of criteria and screening stages. You know, refugee resettlement often prioritizes sort of vulnerability-based criteria, people with injuries or medical problems, other forms of hardship. And then, you know, there's this extensive screening process. And so sort of, you know, awareness of that often determines who is selected for refugee resettlement, who is selected to begin that process. Give us, you know, from what I heard, it sounds like you had a list of 9,000 people. And I didn't hear that you raised, you know, $5 million, which is my quick back of the envelope math for how much it would cost to file for all of them. How do you select people for humanitarian parole, and then like how are the cases considered?
So just to clarify, we're not selecting anyone, period. Like it's everything's a first come first serve basis. So we're and all we're doing is like finding volunteers, which by the way, like sometimes they're lawyers, not all of them are. There's quite a bit of law students. Maybe there could be some really ambitious college students with the supervision of Professor Park and Masterson who have volunteered. And we're matching on a first come first serve basis. And then in terms of the distribution of the funds, we're not, there's no, like it's just like whoever's application is ready to go, it gets mailed out with the money that's available. And I think that like especially because this started in a moment where there was like, I mean, there still is, but there was just so much urgency. It felt really important to not be slowing anything down and to just be like going. And yeah, being somewhat equitable in the sense that we're not comparing applications to each other. I also think it's relevant that this is different from the refugee resettlement process in that this is like a fully discretionary program. So lawyers use this term, especially, I mean, in like all the law, there's stuff where there's like legal standards, there's like criteria, you know, there's rules, like you have to be in a certain age range, you have to like be the residents of a certain place, like you have to have a certain income. Like this isn't that. This is like discretion means like there's no rules. They just decide whatever they want. There's some like, I don't know if saying calling them bars, if Laila, you think that would be just to like caveat that there's like some categories that they could be like, you're a national security threat or something. And yeah, but without getting like too technical, it's basically a free-for-all. And it really is we've already seen this, like, even though they're not adjudicating applications, application first goes through this like lockbox, like USCIS like center, where there's like individual officers that are just like doing different things. Like one family's information is going to like different people, and then like one person is like saying that this was inadequate because of their own desire, and like you need a new address, and like the other family members are like totally fine. So I do think a part of why it's possible and honestly so important to just be so uniform is because it's all gonna like there's no real like it really would be ourselves imposing what we think is like the most risk or the most important, and that just I don't think that felt good for any of us.
And
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna talk about how I think we've mentioned like humanitarian parole was our strategy decision of like what to do, and to explain what we mean by that, like Roxana said, this is really discretionary. There is some criteria for eligibility. You have to show that you have urgent humanitarian need or significant public benefit. And typically like the stereotypical humanitarian parole grant is like somebody who has like a family member on their deathbed and they need to reach them, but for some reason they can't access another process to do that. That is like usually what gets granted. Since this was the only option for so many Afghans, and this we can show urgent humanitarian need, we can show significant public benefit, because those are still our discretionary determinations. We tried it, and we know also that like the government might choose to create a different pathway, and they have at times like changed policies in response to the number of applications they're getting for a certain category of immigration relief. And even if that policy changes, they might still honor those applications, or they might like say that these people applied by a certain date, so they whatever happens, this is a way to get their application in. And I don't think we've talked about this a lot because it really isn't something that we're focused on right now. And it's not something that will result in like a systemic change for the majority of people. But people also were trying to get onto evacuation flights. And this is another way to just say like, if someone is trying to get out of the country, it might help them to have an application in, whatever that is. And humanitarian parole is something that everyone can try, really. It won't affect their other applications if they do this, even if they qualify for something else. So everyone is trying humanitarian parole.
And the only thing that I wanted to say really quickly was just that we touched very briefly earlier about how there aren't good migrants and good refugees and bad refugees. So our structure of taking people first come, first serve and not implementing these screening processes is also our dedication to that ideal.
So, I mean, one thing that sort of, a term that Roxana mentioned that I would like to hear about, whether it's affected your work, is sort of the national security issue that you brought up. I mean, this is something that's commonly addressed in the media, and I'll just say up front, even before asking this question, this is something that I've done research on, and the evidence is just not there. There is not a meaningful link between immigration and crime in this country, and the refugee resettlement program has not led to any terrorism in this country. So it's just the evidence base is clear that immigration and refugees to this country have not been a security threat. That's the evidence, but nonetheless, there is a political. There is a political debate about a national security threat, and that is something that we hear in the media about, and particularly right-wing figures like Tucker Carlson and whatnot sort of evoke this. Has this issue been an obstacle that you've needed to overcome at all in your work over the last 2.5 months?
I can start, and others can feel free to add, but honestly, our focus is like getting these applications in and nobody has reached this stage of like the applications that we're working on. No one has reached a stage of like facing those kinds of obstacles. In general, of course, it impacts the structure that we're working within, and like likely one of the reasons that there are such limited options for people. It's why it was like so chaotic in August at the airport, and it's impacting people. However, like the way that it factors into what our work is that there are screening measures built into every stage of this, right? Like people do a lot of fear mongering, but our immigration system it's housed in the Department of Homeland Security. It is a national security system. It has all these stages of screening people, and like that is why they have such a difficult time to begin with. So yeah, I'll let others add anything else you might have to that.
So to clarify, when I brought up national security, what I was referring to is the immigration laws talk about these thing called national security bars, which means that basically the executive, the president, the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security get like all the discretion in the world when it comes to a case where they think that there's some sort of association with like a quote unquote terrorist group, or there's some kind of like espionage, or like something that falls into like the very, very big bucket of national security implicated. So it's not like domestic, because I think those are slightly different things. The research that I think Professor Masterson is referring to, that I'm really grateful exists, and I'm really grateful to the work of Professor Masterson and others in making it exist, that immigrants and refugees like don't cause violence, is it's separate. Like regardless of that, the like law on the books, Congress has given the president and the Department of Justice and so forth all of the power if they think there's some sort of, and to Laila's point, none of these ones that we're submitting have been adjudicated. It's very possible that some of them are denied for national security reasons. And I know that we're at time, but I, like in my work with Iranians, for example, the national security stuff is just, it's really, it's impossible to overcome. You get into this black box where you can't appeal anything. No one has rights. There's no transparency. What is the national security threat? Where did it come? So yeah, I think as you get even beyond humanitarian parole to asylum for people, ties to anything that like could be conceived of as a potentially terrorist group. And this is just, you know, post 9/11, it's a part of the reality of immigrating to this country for people from the region.
I would add one thing really quickly to that, is that it is affecting some of the decisions people are making right now. Like there are lawyers, for example, really scared of like their clients applying for a passport in Afghanistan if like going to the passport office means having to interact with the Taliban government. Like, will that have national security implications? So it is certainly affecting a lot of the decisions people are making that we are working with.
So I mean, we are at time, and I want to give anybody else a chance to say anything else before we close. Is there any closing comments people want to offer before we wrap up? Okay, well, I mean, Laila, Ugai, Roxana, thank you so very much for joining us today. It would have been great if we could have done this in person, had a live audience. But doing it on Zoom is great too. And I so am grateful for the work that you're doing and for sharing it with us today. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, everyone please join us.
Thank you for
having us.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks for the work that you guys do.